This is an amp that defined the music of the 90s and early 2000s like nothing else out there. So if you're into that era of music, this is one amp that you really need to check out. Hey everyone, this is Karlis from Amalgam Audio, and today we're looking at an amp that defined the music of the 90s and early 2000s like no other amp. The Mesa Boogie Dual Rectifier is an amp that has been used by countless artists of the 90s and 2000s, and it's still being used to this day by many artists. And this is the amp that's literally defined a whole era of music. It would be almost easier to list guys who didn't use it. And it's been used across so many genres, starting from pop, pop rock, heavy rock, some alternative stuff, metal, really heavy, high gain, modern stuff. It's all over the place, and it's been used by very different artists, and it is also capable of a big variety of sounds. It is a very versatile amp. In some regards it might be an acquired taste kind of thing. There's a lot of haters for the dual rectifier. There's this sweet nickname that some people give them, and that's the dual rectum fryer. But this amp has a very unique voice, and it does some things that no other amp can actually do to this level. So this particular amp is the Rev F. To people who don't know the history of the dual rectifier, the early production units that went up to the serial number 500 roughly, they quickly changed revisions. They went through various minor and larger changes, and the most commonly known revision is the Rev G, which still has the dual channel setup. The later versions came with 3 channels, so then you have like those knobs grouped in 3 groups. It's easily to tell them apart visually. And the Rev F is especially well known for its capability in the high gain range, and that's the revision that is favored by guys who are more into modern heavy stuff. So and that's the revision that we got here. And I've been giving a go to the rectifier series a couple of times. I have loaned a couple of other amps. I've done the single rectifier, I've done the triple rectifier, and at one point I tried the multiwatt, but I hadn't released a capture set for that amp. But with all of them I struggled with one thing, and that's getting a considerable amount of gain, good definition, and without too much of the dreaded fizz. And that has been always really difficult for me personally, to dial in those amps in a way that I really like, that there's not too much of this fizz and that there's still enough gain, enough definition at the same time. So it's always been a balancing act, and those amps are not really easy to dial in. But to my positive surprise, this particular amp, maybe because it is the Rev F, or maybe because I'm just a bit more used to those amps at this point, it was way easier to dial in a good saturated high gain tone, keeping it tight and chuggy and responsive, and at the same time get some definition, a lot of definition, and have really minimal fizz. And I think for dual rectifier standards, this amp doesn't exhibit too much of that, and at least it's not to a distracting level. So I really had fun doing captures of this amp. So the user list of this amp is simply insane. So I need a list for that. Again, there's so many genres where this has been used, so the list is grouped a bit by that. And of course it's not extensive, it's just like 30 of the most popular bands. So here we go. Korn, Linkin Park, System of a Down, Deftones, Papa Roach, Slipknot, Diode, Disturbed, Trivium, Lamb of God, Killswitch Engage, Bullet for My Valentine, Parkway Drive, August Burns Red, Machine Head, Avenged Sevenfold, Mastodon, Gojira, Foo Fighters, Blink-182, Green Day, The Offspring, My Chemical Romance, Muse, Dream Theater, Tool, Porcupine Tree, Metallica, Testament, and many others that I'm not going to attempt to list here. It's just an insane list that literally spans so many genres. It's like, I don't know if any other amp has been used to this extent as this particular model. Now about the amp, about its tone and features. It is a very advanced unit. If we're talking about early 90s, it has had a lot of features that were really groundbreaking and new. One of them is that it has the ability to run 6L6 tubes and EL34 tubes. You have a switch in the back for the bias. And if you're going with Mesa Boogie tubes, you can simply buy a quartet of either tubes, put the switch to either position for the specific tube type, and you're done. You don't need to bias anything, you don't need to bring it to the tech, because Mesa Boogie sells their tubes already in the range that this is biased for, so it's extremely simple and convenient. And this amp has 2 channels. The red channel is the higher gain channel. It has more gain than the orange channel. It is more scooped, it has more highs and lows than the orange channel, and that is the stuff that most guys use that are into really heavy genres. But also the orange channel is capable of a lot of gain and capable of high gain, but it's just a different flavor with less gain, more mids, softer. Also, I think the mids are in a different position EQ-wise. So on the back of the amp you have multiple switches that really change a lot of the tonality. So for both channels you have the option to switch them to modern or vintage mode. The modern mode will have more lows, more highs. It's also louder, it pushes the amp more. It's just a bigger, wider sound. And the vintage mode will be again more mid-focused, softer sounding, and a bit quieter. Then you have for the orange channel the switch to go between clean and normal, I think it's called. No, you have the option to switch between clean and high gain. So if you want like a clean channel of this amp, the way to go is you select the orange channel and put it to the clean setting on the back. So further it has, which is also where the name comes from, dual rectifier. It has 2 options for the rectifier section. So one is those 2 big beautiful rectifier tubes, so it can be tube rectified. This is the switch that turns it from tube rectification to the diode mode or solid state mode. So there will be a difference in feel and response. The tube rectifier will be a bit more softer, more spongy. It can get a bit flubby when it's really in a high gain setting. There's also a change for some settings depending on the whole other context. Sometimes the tube rectifier can sound a bit brighter or fizzier, but not in all settings, so you have to experiment with that a bit. And then you have the power switch, which switches between bold and Spongy, and that basically adjusts the voltage level within the amp. And with bold you will have just more headroom, it will be louder and punchier and stronger, and the soft setting will give you a softer, easier response basically. So all of this gives you really a lot of options and variations and tone that you can get out of this, and it doesn't end just there. Prior to experimenting with this amp, every time when I changed output tubes and some vintage style amps, you know, where you can switch between 6L6 and EL34 tubes, the differences in tone were rather minimal actually. In this amp, the difference between using 6L6 tubes and EL34 tubes, it kind of changes it almost in a different amp, so it has as much or more effect than any of the other switches that you have as options on the amp. So it's definitely worth experimenting with both tube types to find out what you like. All those switching options come in really handy at the point where you try to dial in the best sounds for various gain ranges. So there's going to be, at least to my ear, there's a specific set of settings that will work best with a clean sound. Like the Spongy setting on the Spongy bold switch works in the favor of nicer clean tones and some light crunch tones. Same goes for the tube rectification option. It works really great for you know, a nicer, rounder, less maybe sharp clean tone and more like vintage sounding crunch tones. So that's where those features come in really handy. But you also can get away with the tube rectifier on high gain settings. You just have to adjust with the EQ so that the sound doesn't cave in itself and then the bass doesn't get too flubby. But there's like a plethora of options to dial this into your liking. But no matter what, the core character of this amp is the specific, unique thing that also makes this so famous. It's this big, bold sound that has a lot of bottom end that is still tight and chuggy, a lot of top end, a rather recessed mid-range. You know, some people hate that sound, and there are options on this amp to also mitigate that a bit. So you can go to the vintage mode, or actually the EL34 option, specifically for the high gain on the third channel, which is to my ear where that really shined, because it kind of evens out this pronounced mid scoop and gives the mids in the perfectly right spot. Those tones with the EL34 tubes on the red channel are just phenomenal. It's a great sound, and it gets more like a bit more vintagey and less super modern as the amp can sound. So yeah, you have a lot of tools at your disposal with this amp, how you can dial in the tone to your specific playing style, your instrument, or the genre for that you are creating those sounds. And that must be one of the reasons for the success of this model and why it was so widely used. So today I'm really happy that it's worked out to bring in a real guitarist that's a buddy of mine who lives also in Latvia and plays wonderful heavy music in a couple of projects. And yeah, he will give you some demonstrations of this amp. And what we would like to do is first off show the difference between how this amp sounds with 6L6 tubes and EL34 tubes. And we're gonna do the swap on the same settings on the amp so that you hear like literally the effect of the tube change. And then we will also dial in the amp for each specific tube to sound its best and give you a comparison of those. So we're gonna make the comparison on the red channel. So we'll start out with the 6L6 tubes. The amp will be dialed in to sound its best for that specific tube, and then we'll switch over to the EL34s without adjusting the settings first, and then we'll dial in the amp how it sounds best for us for this specific tube. And yeah, let's take a listen at that. And of course it's interesting to hear how the orange and red channel compare to each other. It's not that easy to describe all the differences, and of course a lot of things depend on the settings that you're going to use, but it's basically not really possible to change one channel into the other, like that they sound identical. They will always have their character. And yeah, let's try to get a better grasp of the differences just by a couple of riffs on both channels. We're gonna switch it back and forth a bit so that you have a good grasp of that. So let's take a listen. So the amp is not really legendary for its clean and crunch tones. So if people are looking for a classic clean tone, like from the amps from the 60s, that's not the kind of sound that you're gonna get here. So you can forget about that. And I kind of disliked that aspect of this amp a lot initially. When I started with my first experiments with the previous amps I had loaned, because I was looking for that specific, vintage sound, and it's not going to be here. But at this point, I've already grown to love it for what it is, and this type of clean stuff that it does, it always has this big, broad, modern character. The same goes for the crunch tones. They sound very different than anything from the vintage Fender or Marshall stuff. But you can dial them in to have like a more modern vibe or a more vintage vibe. You can play around with the rectification settings or the vintage switches and all that stuff, and if you prefer you can dial it in towards a more vintagey vibe. That is definitely possible, and you have to take it for what it is. It's not going to sound like a vintage clean or crunched up tone. It's not what it's about, but if you judge it for what it is, it can get really nice cleanish sound and a nice crunch sound. It is the sound of the 90s, and yeah, you can forget if you want like pristine cleans. This amp is literally not capable of that. You can turn the knobs how much you want. There's always a overdrive character slightly even behind the clean tone, so that's not something you can get out of it. As this amp is so extremely versatile, I ended up creating really a lot of captures for this model because there's so many options and a lot of them sound so good. So the capture set for that amp ended up really huge. And the capture set that we initially did of this amp is a DI set, so it's without the cabinet in the capture itself. So for that we provide a separate IR file of this specific Mesa cab, which is just stunning for this kind of high gain stuff. So yeah, it was a lot of work to capture this amp, but I did my best to do it justice, because especially as it is a Revision F, there's a big responsibility behind that to make it right, because people have serious feelings towards them and I don't want to hurt them. And it is not easy to cater for everyone's taste, especially with the high gain and modern stuff, because there are so many genres and use cases and specific needs for this kind of amp. People use them very differently with very different instruments, much more so than with other guitar amps. So I did my best to cater for most of those use cases that I can imagine, and I think I finally might have won this uphill battle that I've had with the Rectifier series for quite some time, and I actually grown pretty fond of this amp. I don't hate it at all, actually. I like it very much for what it is. It gives a very different flavor to the high gain tones from any other amps that I've tried so far. So it sounds way more open and big than, for example, the Mark series, or it's much more dynamic and punchy than the 5150 from PV and all that stuff. So it's it's its own thing. And finally, we closed a rather big glaring gap in our amp catalog and are offering this amp for you to check out. That's it for our today's episode on the Dual Rectifier. I hope you enjoyed it. Fabian's going to play us out with some heavy riffing on captures we did of this amp. Like and subscribe if you like what we're doing here. I hope to see you in the next episode of StoryTime, and see you around.